On July 17, 2023, a man was found dead under mysterious circumstances aboard a night train bound for Denpasar, Bali. That man was Junaid Bagdadi, a high-ranking Hamas commander, whose death would unravel a story of espionage, betrayal, and international intrigue. His body was discovered slumped beside the window, eyes open, expression calm, as though death had approached him quietly, without struggle. The Indonesian authorities called it a heart attack. But in Tel Aviv, analysts called it something else, a message delivered. Hours before his death, surveillance satellites had tracked Baghdadi boarding the train alone, disguised as a cleric. He believed Bali, a neutral island of beaches and prayer, was beyond Mossad's reach. But that illusion, like his cover, would shatter before dawn. Witnesses later recalled 2 Western passengers who vanished at the next station, leaving no trace on the manifest. Their luggage remained, empty, sterile, professionally packed. No fingerprints, no paper, no DNA. Whoever they were, they moved like ghosts through the tropical night. Inside Mossad's Situation Room, the operation had been codenamed Crescent Veil. Weeks of signals intercepts, false passports, and offshore transfers had led to this one moment, when vengeance would travel quietly on steel tracks through the rainforest, unseen and unrecorded. As dawn broke over Bali, whispers spread through intelligence circles. Some said the hit was personal, others called it deterrence. But one truth stood clear. Mossad had crossed another invisible line, turning paradise into a battlefield only a few could see. What began as a single death on a train would soon ignite diplomatic storms across the Middle East, unraveling a chain of covert alliances, double agents, and buried secrets that reached far beyond Bali's shores, into the very heart of global espionage. If stories like this captivate you, real accounts of covert missions, hidden wars, and the shadow world of intelligence, then take a second to support the channel. Hit the like button, drop your city's name in the comments, and subscribe so we can reach more curious minds who crave the truth behind the headlines. Every click helps uncover another secret history buried beneath official silence. Now that you've seen how a single death can ripple through nations, let's pull back the curtain. Who was Junaid Bagdadi? And why did Mossad risk everything to hunt him down on foreign soil? To understand what happened that night on the Bali train, we must first understand the man at its center, Junaid Bagdadi. Born in the crowded alleys of Khan Yunis, he rose from obscurity to become one of Hamas's most elusive operatives, a strategist cloaked in faith and fear alike. He wasn't just a commander, he was the architect of covert funding networks that stretched from Doha to Kuala Lumpur, moving money like smoke through offshore fronts and coded charities. For years, intelligence agencies across continents tried and failed to catch him. Every photo was outdated by the time it surfaced, every signal jammed, every source silenced. To his followers, Baghdadi was a ghost of resistance, a man who defied the reach of the most sophisticated agencies on Earth. To his enemies, he was a phantom thread connecting Hamas's financial arteries to sympathetic regimes and clandestine brokers across Asia. But beneath the ideology lay ambition and betrayal. Reports whispered that Baghdadi had begun negotiating independently, cutting deals that threatened both allies and adversaries. He had information, names, routes, operations, data that could cripple entire networks if it ever fell into Israeli hands. And that made him dangerous, not just to Israel, but to his own people. So when Mossad received fragments of intercepted chatter, a man booking a quiet train from Jakarta to Denpasar under a false cleric's name, alarms went off in Tel Aviv's corridors. This wasn't coincidence, it was opportunity. A single, fleeting chance to erase a shadow that had lingered for a decade. But one question lingers even now. Was Junaid Bagdadi targeted for what he had done, or for what he was about to do? It was a turbulent time in the Middle East, a region breathing in cycles of retaliation and silence. The year was 2023, and the fragile threads of diplomacy were fraying once again. While Western capitals talked peace, the reality on the ground was a chessboard soaked in shadows, spies, informants, cyber warriors, and assassins. The war between Israel and Hamas had long transcended borders. It had become a global contest of intelligence, influence, and ideology. In Tel Aviv, Mossad was evolving, less about brute operations, more about precision, stealth, and deniability. Its new directorate saw the world not in front lines, but in networks, financial trails, encrypted couriers, digital fingerprints buried in offshore accounts. In their eyes, men like Junaid Bagdadi weren't soldiers. They were architects of chaos, funding war from afar while their hands appeared clean. Neutralizing such figures wasn't revenge, it was strategy. Across the Mediterranean, Gaza simmered under siege. Every strike from the air invited rockets in return. Every truce was a pause before another storm. Baghdadi's growing influence, his secret trips through Malaysia, Indonesia, and Turkey, alarmed not just Israel, but Egypt, Jordan, and even quiet partners who feared his widening reach. He wasn't moving weapons, he was moving loyalty, buying silence in places where the law stopped at the border. Meanwhile, Indonesia, the world's largest Muslim nation, prided itself on neutrality. But beneath its calm surface, competing interests were stirring. Foreign money, ideological sympathies, and unmonitored movements. Bali, a tourist paradise, became the perfect blind spot for covert exchanges. Intelligence analysts noted unusual encrypted traffic through its consulates, small shipments rerouted through ports, and the arrival of religious delegates with diplomatic immunity. Within Mossad's inner circles, Bali appeared as a clean page. No history of counterintelligence interference, no Israeli footprint, and no global scrutiny. An ideal setting for a mission that had to vanish the moment it succeeded. But pulling off such an operation demanded more than skill. It demanded silence, plausibility, and precision measured in seconds. And while Tel Aviv prepared, the rest of the world turned oblivious eyes to the region's silent war, where assassinations were debated not in headlines, but in encrypted channels and midnight briefings. The CIA watched, curious but distant. European agencies listened, unwilling to interfere. Everyone wanted plausible deniability, no one wanted fingerprints. By the time whispers of Operation Crescent Veil reached the field, the machinery of espionage had already been set in motion. Months of deception, false identities, and data laundering had built toward one night on a moving train in Bali, where the past 2 decades of regional conflict would silently converge in a single act of surgical disappearance. That train didn't just carry passengers. It carried the weight of nations, the echo of long wars, and the invisible hands of intelligence officers who would never be named. Inside a dimly lit conference room deep within Tel Aviv's intelligence compound, a handful of senior operatives circled a table strewn with photographs, travel manifests, and intercepted messages. The plan began not with vengeance, but with calculation. Neutralize a node that sustained a wider network. Years of watching had produced an image of Baghdadi's movements, sporadic, careful, but now brittle. The director signed off quietly. The decision passed through 3 levels of review. This was not a battlefield strike. It was a surgical erasure that had to leave nothing to prove. Why a train in Bali? Analysts argued the choice in technical terms and moral ones. Bali offered deniability, neutral jurisdiction, heavy tourist traffic, and limited regional intelligence presence. A public platform, packed carriages and transient witnesses, would disguise targeted action as ordinary misfortune. The method minimized collateral damage and reduced the political shock of an overt strike. Operationally, a moving target in foreign territory also constrained investigations. Evidence could be muddled by jurisdictional fog. For Mossad's planners, the calculus was clear. Make the disappearance look like life's randomness, not an act of statecraft. Preparation unfolded like clockwork, measured in small, mundane deceptions. Human sources in Kuala Lumpur and Jakarta had shadowed Baghdadi's safe houses. A chain of low-level couriers had been flipped or compromised to reveal booking patterns. Technical teams traced his encrypted messages to a temporary hotspot, then to a specific travel window. False identity specialists forged documents so clean they would pass casual inspection. Cutouts created layers of separation so that no single paper trail led back to the operation's architects. Logistics required international choreography. A handful of operatives would assume civilian covers, a tour guide, a relief worker, 2 tourists, each with rehearsed backstories. Local contractors provided legitimate services, a catering company for a staged event, a transportation firm for a van that would never be reported, and a private clinic that could later certify a natural death if needed. Satellite comms and secure mesh devices kept teams linked without leaving conventional records. Analysts ran redundancy plans. If one node failed, alternative feeds would kick in. If local law enforcement probed, medical emergency narratives were already prepped. Surveillance and counter-surveillance layered the approach. Distant observers tracked Baghdadi's movements with camera feeds and plainclothes tails. Embedded technical teams monitored his mobile signals and the train's telemetry. To prevent detection, electronic footprinting was limited. Signals were brief, burst transmitted via an orbiting relay, then scrubbed. Agents practiced meeting protocols in safe houses until interactions felt routine. Every scenario had an exit: staged illnesses, timed distractions, and pre-positioned decoys that could absorb attention. Ethics and legality simmered under the operation's surface. Within the agency, a small legal cell argued the international consequences. An operation on foreign soil risked diplomatic damage if exposed. Morally, officers debated whether targeting a single individual for systemic problems soothed anything long-term. These debates shaped constraints: no explosive devices, no overt firefights, minimal force. The objective was removal, not spectacle. Psychological operations were as important as physical ones. To shape the aftermath, Mossad's media planners quietly seeded narratives through anonymous channels, reports emphasizing a sudden illness, corroborating tourist stress stories, and releasing mundane passenger statements that supported a nonviolent explanation. Simultaneously, financial teams prepared to disrupt any immediate attempts by Baghdadi's network to retaliate, freezing suspect accounts, alerting partners to suspicious flows, and isolating complicit intermediaries. Risk assessment dominated rehearsals. What if Baghdadi resisted? What if local authorities prolonged investigation? What if a slip betrayed state involvement? Contingencies multiplied. A rapid extraction by boarding a different carriage, an emergency medical call with a prearranged response, an unwell passenger who inadvertently became the plausible cause of death. Teams drilled these contingencies until execution felt less like improvisation and more like muscle memory. As final checks completed, a hush fell over the operation's inner circle. Papers were incinerated, digital traces obscured, and the few who knew were reduced to silent competence. The plan's human face, the operatives boarding the night train, packed their covers with care, exchanged last-minute signals, and readied themselves to perform ordinary roles in extraordinary circumstances. Secrecy was the first weapon. Plausibility was the second. When the chosen night arrived, the island hummed with unremarkable life. Markets, beaches, late prayers. The mission's machinery, however, had already begun its quiet rotation. Satellites in low orbit, a relay station routing briefed bursts of data, tales blending with holiday crowds, and a small team poised to turn a traveling carriage into the scene of a truth that would be denied in daylight. The world moved on outside. Inside the carriages, decades of covert conflict were about to converge in measured, irreversible seconds. The overhead lights in Carriage C hummed like a distant city as the train accelerated into the night. Inside, ordinary rhythms kept time. Pages turned, a baby cried, the kettle clinked in the dining car. At 23:12, the team slipped into place, blends of ordinary humanity with calibrated intent. They laughed softly, shared small talk, and let their presence dissolve into the carriage's background noise. Nothing about them should attract notice. The man with the faded cleric's robe, Baghdadi in disguise, clutched a small prayer book and watched the passing darkness. He had slept and woken and slept again, a pattern of travel exhaustion that made him predictable. Across the aisle, a woman adjusted her scarf and hummed a lullaby. Behind her, a tourist argued about visas with a guard who would never recall his face. The rhythm of travel masked the steady, invisible tension coiled beneath. A sound, a distant metallic ping, almost swallowed by the rails, registered only in the ears trained to listen. For the rest, It was the ordinary music of a machine. The team's eyes flicked, measured, returned to ordinary conversation. Agents kept their hands where witnesses might see them. A folded newspaper, a sleeve tugged straight, the pretense of unremarkable gestures. Their training was not to perform heroics but to be forgettable, to make a moment vanish into memory. At the tunnel's mouth, the world contracted into darkness. The train's power dimmed for a heartbeat. A single carriage light stuttered. In that compression, every small sound expanded. Breathing, the scrape of a shoe, the thump of a bag settling on a rack. Baghdadi shifted in his seat, momentarily disoriented by the drop in illumination. Someone said a phrase that could mean nothing to casual ears, and Baghdadi's posture tightened. The play had begun. Time inside that tunnel felt altered, elastic. Seconds stretched into an eternity where a single touch carried the weight of consequence. An operative moved beside Baghdadi with the practiced softness of someone who has learned how to go unnoticed. Voices around them blurred into white noise. A child's laughter rose and fell. Outside, rain hammered the carriage roof like a distant percussion, lending the world a sense of ritual. Inside, two lives crossed paths with intent. There was no shouting. There was no crowd, no visible scuffle. Instead, there were micro-movements, a hand on a sleeve, a whispered line that might have been a blessing, the slight lean of a body shifting to buy space. Observers later would describe a tableau of ordinary travel, older men consulting maps, couples asleep, a vendor adjusting his tray. For the trained eyes, however, the choreography read like a score of precise cues executed without fanfare. When the tunnel ended, daylight leaked back in, thin, gray, as if the world were peeking to see what had been rearranged in its dark. The carriage's fluorescent lights resumed their rhythm. Baghdadi slumped, a slow, almost unnoticed droop, his head lolling toward the window. A passenger nearby wiped his hands on a napkin and poured tea. The few who looked saw a man overcome by exhaustion. No one imagined a web of nations tightening around that seat. What followed was the patient unspooling of prearranged responses. A companion, an actor in a larger play, began a panicked call to attenders, citing vague illness. Others offered quiet aid, a blanket, a pillow, the measured calm of those who know how to make chaos look harmless. By the time the conductor reached the carriage, the narrative suggested a simple tragedy. Documents were produced, a pretext formed. The scene took on the hues of inevitability. Across the sea, in rooms full of screens, the silence was different, charged and clinical. Analysts watched telemetry confirm the train's segment, track handoffs between stations, and observe the tiny human irregularity that would be read as the final datum of the operation. In Bali, local responders did what they do best. They followed protocol, recorded observations, and filed a report that would later be folded into the story of a man felled by natural causes. The gap between the two stories, one public, one private, would be a chasm full of consequence. Evening turned to morning. Passengers murmured about delays, the scenic view stealing attention from what had happened in a windowless minute. An empty tray sat untouched. A single passport lay where it had slipped from a pocket. Officials would later mark the death with forms and stamps. Families would grieve. Back channels would vibrate with grateful silence, relieved that the operation had not become a spectacle. For those who planned it, the measure of success was not applause but absence. No smoking gun, only the slow certification of a life ended, yet accomplishment carried an aftertaste. The team disembarked into the anonymity of crowds, faces folding back into the ordinary. A few lingered for a moment, eyes meeting in the language of those who had just enacted something irrevocable. They did not celebrate. They sorted through the emotional calculus instead. Relief, the ache of necessity, the knowledge that even success would not erase consequences. The mission's visible end, one fewer man in the world, was merely the beginning of a different kind of work. Containment, narrative shaping, and the careful tending of diplomatic embers. By dawn, headlines would call it a sudden death. Intelligence circles would whisper of a precise removal. For the operation itself, the moment of reckoning was quiet. The carriage empty where a life had been, the rhythm of the train unchanged, and a message delivered that would travel further than the rails. Whether the mission was a triumph or a transgression would depend on the light in which later eyes chose to view it. For the men and women who had carried it out, it was, at last, accomplished, silent, surgical, and irrevocable. Dawn in Bali came soft and golden, as though the island itself refused to believe what had happened in the night. The train rolled into the station, a few minutes late, its passengers groggy and silent. Word spread quickly. A foreign man had died on board. The local police sealed the carriage, curious but calm. After all, deaths in transit were not unheard of. But within hours, as intelligence liaisons quietly alerted embassies, the story began to ripple far beyond Indonesia's borders. In Gaza, the news arrived cloaked in disbelief. Hamas's internal channels buzzed with confusion. There had been no warning, no signs of illness. To them, Junaid Bagdadi wasn't just another commander. He was the gatekeeper of critical funding routes, a man who carried secrets more valuable than his life. Official statements were delayed, cautious, then abruptly defiant. Brother Junaid died in service to the cause, one spokesman declared, though few seemed convinced by the simplicity of that line. Behind closed doors, panic settled in. Their encrypted channels had gone silent, their safe routes suddenly compromised. Meanwhile, Israel said nothing. No leaks, no triumph. Silence was the perfect admission. Within Mossad's corridors, the tone was clinical, almost cold. The operation file was sealed, its codename archived among dozens of other nameless missions that would never be acknowledged. The only hint of success came in a short encrypted transmission to the Prime Minister's office. Crescent veil completed. No exposure. Full denial possible. In Tehran, anger brewed. Iranian state-linked outlets accused Zionist agents of operating on sacred Muslim soil, calling the act an insult to sovereignty. Indonesian officials found themselves walking a diplomatic tightrope, promising thorough investigation while quietly urged by allies to keep the case local and quiet. The body was autopsied, cremated per family request, and flown out discreetly. The medical report listed acute cardiac arrest. By the third day, Arab media began spinning conspiracies that the death was an inside betrayal, a Qatari message to Hamas, or perhaps even a joint Western-Israeli operation meant to disrupt upcoming funding conferences. Each outlet found a version that suited its politics. The truth, as always, dissolved beneath the noise. Inside Israel, a few intelligence veterans raised quiet concern. Every shadow kill creates another, one analyst wrote in a classified memo, and the silence between them is never peace. But such reflections carried no weight in policy rooms. The geopolitical machinery had already moved on. New lists, new names, new plans. In the cafes of Denpasar, the story faded as quickly as it appeared. Tourists boarded trains, unaware that the seat near the window had been scrubbed twice that morning. For the locals, it was a passing curiosity. For Mossad, it was a closed chapter. For Hamas, it was an open wound. And yet, beneath the calm of public statements, something shifted. Allies began questioning just how far Israel's reach extended. Enemies grew quieter, recalibrating their sense of safety. And in the invisible corridors of espionage, respect mingled uneasily with fear. The mission had achieved its goal, but it had also redrawn unseen boundaries across the map of modern warfare. In the weeks that followed, the story of Junaid Bagdadi's death fractured into a dozen competing versions, each more intricate, more politically charged than the last. The official narrative remained simple: a sudden medical collapse aboard a train in Bali, confirmed by local police and supported by autopsy. But in the opaque world of espionage, simplicity itself was suspicious. Few believed a man like Bagdadi, who had survived drone strikes, financial freezes, and endless pursuit, had simply died of nature's will. One version came from Hamas's inner circle, that Bagdadi had been poisoned by his own allies, men who feared his growing independence and secret negotiations with foreign donors. A few whispered that he had been preparing to defect, carrying digital archives of accounts and contact networks. If true, his death saved many reputations and silenced a man who might have exposed them all. Others in Gaza went further, suggesting Mossad's hand not in his killing, but in manipulating internal mistrust that led to it. "He was killed by paranoia we planted," one anonymous source allegedly boasted on encrypted boards. Meanwhile, a leaked document circulated in Southeast Asian intelligence forums. Purportedly, an internal Indonesian report suppressed before publication. It described anomalies, faint chemical traces on the seat upholstery, erased CCTV segments at 2 stations, and a tourist couple who exited minutes after the death but never appeared in immigration databases. The report concluded cautiously. Possibility of foreign intelligence involvement cannot be excluded. Within days, the document vanished from online archives. Copies, however, lingered in private channels, feeding endless speculation. From Western intelligence analysts, another theory emerged, that Baghdadi had been part of a covert deal between rival factions, and Mossad's operation was more about containment than elimination. According to this account, the hit was preemptive, a strike to prevent sensitive data from being exchanged with Iran or Turkey. The name Operation Crescent Veil began to appear in obscure forums, its authenticity never confirmed, yet never denied. The ambiguity suited everyone. Critics and moral philosophers raised harder questions. Was such an act, on neutral soil, without declaration or trial, an act of defense or of lawlessness? Indonesia had not been informed, nor had any authority authorized lethal force within its borders. International law scholars debated the ethics of plausible deniability, noting that the line between assassination and preemptive defense had blurred beyond recognition. In secret briefings, Western diplomats reportedly asked Israel whether the operation had risked diplomatic fallout. The answer, as always, was silence. Then came a new twist. A recording surfaced online, allegedly of Baghdadi himself. In it, a voice claimed to have uncovered betrayal among brothers and warned that money has replaced mission. Authenticity experts were divided. Some swore it was him, others said it was an AI simulation seeded deliberately by intelligence units to distort the narrative. Within 48 hours, the clip was taken down, but not before it reignited the rumor mill. Each retelling blurred truth further. Some imagined Baghdadi alive, relocated under new identity. Others insisted his remains never reached family hands, suggesting a secret burial. Indonesian locals described strange foreign men at the crematorium. Others said they saw diplomats arrive before dawn. Every clue contradicted another. In Tel Aviv, internal debates remained classified, but leaked fragments hinted at unease. Younger analysts, raised in an era of transparency, questioned the cost of perpetual silence. One memo read, "Invisibility preserves security, but erodes accountability. We erase enemies and invent ghosts." Senior officials ignored it. The machine of secrecy demanded continuity. By the time the story settled, there was no single truth, only versions layered like sediment, official, plausible, and mythic. The death of Junaid Bagdadi became a mirror, reflecting each faction's fears and needs. To some, he was a martyr. To others, a liability removed. For Israel, a tactical success. For Indonesia, an uncomfortable secret buried under paradise. And for history, yet another puzzle whispered between those who operate where nations deny they ever walk. Strategically, the elimination of Junaid Bagdadi was more than a single covert success. It was a chess move that reshaped the unseen architecture of Middle Eastern power. Within intelligence circles, it was whispered that Mossad's operation in Bali marked a turning point in the geography of espionage, a demonstration that no sanctuary, no neutral ground, no corner of the world was truly beyond reach. In the short term, the operation achieved its tactical objective. Hamas's financial arteries, those delicate offshore veins running through Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Gulf, collapsed in confusion. Accounts froze overnight. Couriers disappeared. Donations meant for Gaza's militant infrastructure stalled in bureaucratic limbo. Without Baghdadi's network management, millions in covert funds went dark. To Israeli analysts, this disruption equaled a year's worth of airstrikes, achieved without a single public confrontation. But in politics, precision often births consequence. Indonesia, humiliated by the quiet violation of its sovereignty, began tightening surveillance on foreign travelers, expelling suspected Western consultants, and freezing minor diplomatic initiatives with Tel Aviv's unofficial intermediaries. Officials maintained public neutrality, but internal communications dripped resentment, an unspoken warning that future violations would not go unanswered. Iran, meanwhile, saw opportunity in outrage. State media branded the act a blasphemy on Muslim soil, using it to rally sympathy across the Islamic world. Within weeks, Tehran sponsored a series of counter-covert projects aimed at reminding Israel and the world that shadows can strike back. Cyber intrusions spiked across Israeli infrastructure, small yet symbolic. For every Mossad victory, Iran's Revolutionary Guard sought a mirrored retaliation, sometimes not through force, but through rumor. In Tel Aviv, Mossad's inner circle celebrated quietly but reflected grimly. Every flawless operation carried invisible costs. Success bred exposure. Exposure bred countermeasures. Analysts understood that by proving its reach, Israel had also exposed its pattern. If Bali could host such an operation, so could Kuala Lumpur, Doha, or Nairobi. Allies admired the skill. Adversaries studied the method. In the great intelligence game, today's triumphs are tomorrow's training manuals for the enemy. The diplomatic fallout rippled outward in quieter forms. ASEAN nations, uneasy about Western intelligence footprints in their territories, began drafting new security protocols restricting surveillance cooperation. Some even approached Beijing for consultative guidance, inadvertently tilting regional intelligence alignment toward China, a long-term strategic shift that Israel had not anticipated. The dominoes fell not through anger, but through recalibration, each country asking if Bali wasn't safe, what else isn't. Inside Hamas, Baghdadi's death triggered paranoia that bordered on implosion. Commanders distrusted each other, suspecting internal leaks. Messages turned curt, meetings delayed. A power vacuum opened that Israel exploited indirectly, feeding false leads, amplifying suspicion, and letting the organization consume itself from within. Yet the chaos also birthed new leaders, more reckless, less pragmatic, eager to avenge humiliation with public spectacle. The pendulum of strategy began to swing again. For Israel, Operation Crescent Veil became both proof and warning, proof that surgical precision could achieve results without collateral visibility, and warning that the shadows were finite. They could only hold so many secrets before light leaked through. In private briefings, senior analysts called it a victory that glows too brightly. Each detail that impressed allies also tempted adversaries to replicate it. Geopolitically, the mission underscored a larger truth. In the modern era, warfare no longer needed borders or declarations. Espionage had become the new diplomacy, silent but decisive. States communicated through operations, assassinations, cyber intrusions, disappearances. Baghdadi's death was not just retaliation, it was negotiation through action, a statement of capability in the language of fear. And yet, beneath all triumph, questions endured. Had Mossad's strike advanced Israel's security, or merely deepened the endless cycle of covert retribution? Was the operation an act of prevention or provocation? The victory on paper looked absolute. In spirit, it was ambiguous. For every target eliminated, two new threats were already emerging in the static of global networks. When the dust settled, strategists would later agree on one phrase to summarize the event: militarily flawless, politically radioactive. Over time, Operation Crescent Veil transformed from a whispered success into a legend. Half-truth, half-myth, preserved in the folklore of intelligence officers and dark historians who trade in secrets instead of sources. It became one of those operations that no government ever acknowledged, yet everyone in the trade seemed to know. The name Bali ceased to conjure beaches or temples. Within the world of espionage, it came to mean precision, audacity, and moral ambiguity. In the Israeli intelligence community, the mission was quietly studied in training modules under disguised titles: Operation Redacted, the Southeast File, or Case 47. Cadets were told to analyze it for lessons on plausible deniability, the psychology of low visibility strikes, and the art of narrative management. The internal debriefs did not celebrate it. They dissected it. The success was cold, mathematical, 0 exposure, 1 elimination, full control of the information stream. Yet, older operatives called it the operation that looked too perfect, warning that perfection often conceals unseen fractures. For Hamas, Junaid Bagdadi's death hardened into a cautionary myth. His portrait appeared briefly in memorial posters across Gaza before being quietly removed, perhaps because no one could agree on how to tell his story. Was he a martyr, betrayed by a friend, or a man undone by his own secrecy? Underground sympathizers spoke his name with reverence. Leadership circles avoided it altogether, fearing that remembering him meant admitting vulnerability. Meanwhile, in Indonesia, the event's aftertaste lingered in bureaucratic corridors. Officials never named Mossad, but policy shifted subtly. Security agencies received new powers to vet foreign NGOs, visas, and research delegations. Intelligence cooperation with regional partners increased quietly. The Balinese rail line was fitted with new surveillance systems, though their purpose was never publicly stated. The government maintained composure, yet privately, it resolved never again to host another nation's ghosts. Writers and filmmakers hungry for drama began adapting the story into speculative thrillers. Independent documentaries hinted at an unconfirmed Western operation on Asian soil. Fiction blurred into history. Viewers were told of the man who died on the train and the agents who vanished with the dawn. Each version twisted the details, but one theme remained constant. That morality fades in the realm of necessity. Critics debated the ethics endlessly. Human rights commentators condemned it as a violation of international law, a breach of sovereignty disguised as security. Realists countered that it was a necessary evil, proof that deterrence in the 21st century required asymmetrical precision, not public war. Philosophers framed it as a study in modern morality. What is justice when the courtroom is replaced by a carriage and verdicts are executed without a judge? Years later, declassified fragments, redacted memos, encrypted transmission logs, scraps of foreign surveillance data surfaced in obscure archives. They confirmed nothing and suggested everything. The official stance remained unchanged. There was no operation, no mission, no acknowledgement. But in the silence of governments, history filled the gaps. Today, Operation Crescent Veil stands as a paradox, an invisible act that left visible ripples. To intelligence officers, it's a blueprint. To politicians, a liability. To historians, a riddle with no conclusion. And to those who still believe in moral clarity, it's a reminder that nations too can trade their conscience for security and call it victory. In the end, the train kept moving. That image, an empty seat, a landscape passing in silence, became the perfect metaphor for the shadow wars of our age. Operation Crescent Veil ended, but its echoes never did. Junaid Bagdadi was gone, yet the world that created him remained unchanged, secretive, divided, endlessly circling the same questions that no nation dares to ask aloud. What truly changed that night in Bali? Perhaps nothing. Perhaps everything. A single death shifted no borders, ended no wars, brought no peace. Yet it altered how power was imagined, how far a state could go in pursuit of its own security, how quietly justice could be rewritten to suit necessity. The world moved 1 inch deeper into the gray, where morality bends to the logic of survival. In Israel, the mission was shelved and forgotten, at least on paper. But the officers who carried it out never forgot the stillness that followed. The realization that the line between defense and vengeance is thinner than a heartbeat. Some called it a victory. Others privately called it a warning. Every ghost made in darkness eventually haunts its maker. Across the sea, new figures rose to replace the fallen. New plots formed, new alliances hardened. The great machinery of espionage ground onward, indifferent to the human weight behind every operation. Baghdadi's death became another data point, another lesson in the silent arithmetic of statecraft. History didn't close his file. It absorbed it. And so, as we look back at that night, at the tunnel, the rain, the vanished men, the seat left empty, we're left with a question that refuses to fade. Can a nation defend itself without losing its soul? Or are these the same thing, merely measured on different scales of sacrifice? If this story fascinated you, if the unseen corridors of power, betrayal, and consequence speak to you, subscribe, turn on the bell, and join us. Because in the world of espionage and history, every ending is just the beginning of another secret.